It was a late evening flight from Chicago to Seattle, the kind where half the passengers are dozing off before takeoff, lulled by the dim cabin lights and the soft hum of the engines. I found my seat, 24C, an aisle seat in the economy section, sandwiched between a weary-looking businessman to my right and an empty seat by the window. With a small sigh of relief for the extra space, I settled in, pulling a book from my backpack. The flight attendants did their usual dance of safety instructions as the plane taxied to the runway, their movements synchronized with the safety video playing overhead. As we ascended, the skyline of Chicago became a tapestry of twinkling lights against the velvet night, gradually fading into the distance. The businessman beside me had already nodded off, his head lolling slightly with the motion of the aircraft. I tried to focus on my book, but my attention kept drifting to the empty seat next to me. It was odd, considering the flight was almost full. A fleeting shadow passed over the seat, probably just a trick of the light as someone walked down the aisle to the bathroom, I reasoned. An hour into the flight, with the drone of the engines as a constant backdrop, I felt an inexplicable chill, despite the blanket I had draped over my legs. The cabin was dim, most passengers either asleep or lost in their screens, earphones in, isolated in their own little bubbles of light. That's when I noticed it. The seatbelt of the empty seat next to me was now fastened. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, thinking sleep was playing tricks on me. But no, the belt was definitely clicked in place, the strap pulled tight across the seat. Curiosity piqued, I nudged the businessman awake, asking if he'd seen anyone sitting there, or perhaps a flight attendant securing the belt. He blinked at me, bleary-eyed and confused, muttering a half-hearted "no" before turning away to sleep again. I called over a flight attendant, a young woman with a friendly smile, and inquired about the seatbelt. She glanced at the seat, then at her clipboard. "Oh, that's strange," she remarked. "It's listed as unoccupied. Maybe I did it out of habit and forgot. Sorry for any confusion." Her explanation seemed plausible, and yet, as she walked away, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. The cabin felt colder now, the whispers of air from the vents more like breaths on the back of my neck. Attempting to shake off the feeling, I turned my attention back to my book, but the words blurred before my eyes. The chill persisted, wrapping around me like an unwelcome embrace. I decided to try and sleep, hoping to find some escape in dreams from the uneasiness that clung to me. As I drifted into a fitful slumber, I dreamt of standing in the aisle of the plane, the cabin shrouded in shadows deeper than any normal flight. The seats were all empty, save for one. In my dream, I approached the seat, heart pounding, and as I neared, the figure of a person became visible. They were turned away from me, looking out the window at the night sky, their bodies still and silent. I reached out, a question forming on my lips, but before I could speak, the figure slowly turned to face me. Their features were indistinct, blurred as if I was looking at them through water. But the eyes were a piercing blue, so vivid against the dimness. I awoke with a start, the remnants of the dream fading but the feeling of those eyes watching me lingering. The seatbelt next to me was unfastened now, the seat as empty as it had been at the beginning of the flight. I shivered, not from the cold but from something deeper, a primal fear that had taken root in my chest. Trying to calm my racing heart, I glanced around. The other passengers seemed undisturbed, ensconced in their personal silences. The businessman beside me was awake now, typing away on his laptop, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his face. I wanted to ask him if he had noticed anything, if he had felt it too, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain the unexplainable? The rest of the flight passed in a haze, each minute stretching out before me with agonizing slowness. When we finally landed in Seattle, the relief that washed over me was palpable. As I stood to gather my things, I couldn't resist one last look at the empty seat. It was just a seat, nothing more. And yet, as I walked down the aisle, the echo of a whisper followed me. A voice as clear as if someone was standing right beside me, saying, "You saw me." I didn't look back. I couldn't. Stepping into the airport, the normalcy of the bustling terminal felt surreal, as if I had stepped out of one world and into another. The experience on the flight lingered with me, a shadow at the edge of my memory. Days turned into weeks, and the incident on Flight 714 slowly receded into the back of my mind, becoming one of those bizarre stories you share at gatherings, where the lines between reality and the tricks of memory blur. Yet, there was an undercurrent of unease that I couldn't quite shake off, a lingering shadow that followed me into the night whenever the lights were out, and the world outside my window was bathed in darkness. One day, I saw such a post on Reddit. It was a collection of stories shared by pilots and flight attendants about experiences that defied explanation. The kind of incidents that were unofficially omitted from reports for fear of ridicule or damaging the airline's reputation. It was here, among tales of spectral figures seen in cockpits and disembodied voices over the intercom, that I found a story. It was posted by a flight attendant who had been working on a flight some years back. Coincidentally, it was a flight from Seattle to Chicago. By the way, the flight where I discovered the weird incident before was from Chicago to Seattle. Halfway through the flight, she noticed that one of the seats, which had been empty during takeoff, now appeared to be occupied by a man. She assumed she had simply missed him boarding, but when she checked the passenger manifest, there was no record of him. The man was polite, declined any refreshments, and kept to himself. When the plane landed, the man was nowhere to be seen. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The flight attendant and her colleagues searched the plane, but there was no sign of the man, no belongings left behind, nothing. It was as if he had never been there. Reading that account, a chill ran down my spine. But the story offered no explanations, no reasons, only more questions. But in a way, it was a validation of my experience, a sign that I wasn't alone in what I had witnessed. It didn't bring me peace, exactly, but there was a certain comfort in knowing that the world held more mysteries than we were meant to understand. Since then, I've flown several times, each journey an exercise in apprehensive anticipation. I watched the empty seats, half expecting to see something, someone, that defies explanation. But the skies have remained clear, the passengers accounted for, and the flights uneventful. And yet, every time I buckle my seatbelt and the plane begins its ascent, I find myself thinking back to Flight 714, to the passenger who wasn't there, and I wonder about the boundaries between our world and the next, about the travelers who may pass through unseen. It's a mystery that remains unsolved, a story without an end, and maybe, just maybe, that's how some stories are meant to be. I had always considered myself lucky for never having to endure the typical horrors of air travel. No missed flights, lost luggage, or unsavory seatmates. That streak of good fortune came to an abrupt end on a late-night flight from Miami to Denver. The ordeal has since convinced me that the worst things one can encounter on a plane aren't the inconveniences of physical space or time, but those that trespass the boundaries of reality itself. The flight was far from full, a fact I attributed to the late departure time. I chose an aisle seat towards the back, a preference for those rare occasions when sleep overcomes my usual restlessness. The cabin lights dimmed as we reached cruising altitude, the soft snoring and occasional rustling of passengers the only sounds in the otherwise silent interior. I closed my eyes, intending to rest, if not sleep, when a subtle change in the air pressure, or perhaps the temperature, prompted me to open them again. That's when I noticed the man in the row opposite mine, seated by the window. There was nothing particularly remarkable about him at first glance. Average build, nondescript clothing, hair slightly disheveled as if he'd rushed to make the flight. Yet, there was an aura of dissonance about him, a feeling that he was somehow out of place, not in the sense of belonging to a different flight, but to a different time, or even reality. I watched him, curiosity piqued, as he remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on the window, the reflection of the dim cabin lights obscuring his face. It was only when a sudden bout of turbulence shook the plane, a jarring contrast to the flight's smooth progress thus far, that he moved. He turned his head, slowly, deliberately, until his eyes met mine. The chill that ran through me then was like none I had ever experienced. It was not the cold of physical discomfort, but a deeper, more primal reaction. His eyes were entirely black, devoid of sclera or iris, windows not to the soul but to an abyss that threatened to engulf me. I broke the connection, my heart racing, and looked away, only to find the cabin as it was, passengers undisturbed by the turbulence or the presence of the man. I questioned my own perception, wondering if the shadows and the cabin's dim lighting were playing tricks on my mind. Compelled by a mixture of fear and fascination, I glanced back, only to find his seat empty, as though he had never been there. I searched the cabin, thinking he might have moved, but there was no sign of him. The unease that had settled over me grew, a tangible weight that made it difficult to breathe. Unable to sit still, I rose under the pretense of stretching my legs, my real intention to confirm the man's absence. As I passed the row where he had been seated, a sudden, inexplicable cold enveloped me, a cold that seemed to seep into my very bones. The air smelled faintly of the sea, a briny, damp scent that had no place in an aircraft's recycled atmosphere. I hurried back to my seat, the sensation of being watched prickling at the back of my neck. The rest of the flight passed in a blur of anxiety and suppressed fear. When we landed in Denver, the relief I felt was tinged with an unshakable sense of dread, the kind that lingers long after the cause is removed. In the days that followed, I found myself haunted by the experience, the memory of the man's black eyes and the inexplicable cold refusing to fade. I scoured the internet for similar experiences, desperate for an explanation that would restore a sense of normalcy to my world. Yet, the search yielded nothing, leaving me with more questions than answers. My job as a corporate auditor often had me flying from coast to coast, a routine that became as mundane as the daily commute for others. However, a late winter flight from Boston to San Francisco offered a departure from the ordinary that still sends a shiver down my spine whenever my mind wanders back to it. The flight wasn't particularly crowded, a benefit of traveling late on a Tuesday. I found myself seated in 17A, a window seat with an unobstructed view of the gray, overcast sky as we ascended. The drone of the engines provided a monotone backdrop as I settled into my seat, the landscape below quickly becoming obscured by clouds. An hour into the flight, as I skimmed through a report, a sudden movement caught my eye. It was subtle, a shadow passing briefly over the wing, as if something, or someone, had momentarily blocked the sparse light filtering through the clouds. I glanced around, half expecting to see a flight attendant or a fellow passenger looking out, their curiosity piqued by the same anomaly. but all I met were the disinterested gazes of people absorbed in their own worlds. Attributing it to a trick of the light, or perhaps a fleeting cloud, I redirected my attention back to my work, the odd occurrence quickly forgotten. It wasn't until the captain announced our initial descent into San Francisco that things took an undeniably strange turn. As the plane began its gradual descent, the cabin lights dimmed, bathing the interior in a soft, eerie glow. It was then, from the corner of my eye, that I saw it again. A silhouette against the wing, distinct and unmistakably human in shape. I turned my head, staring out the window, expecting to see nothing but the expanse of the wing and the clouds below. Instead, I was met with the sight of a figure standing on the wing, their features blurred by the speed and altitude, yet undeniably there. Panic surged through me, a cold, gripping fear that left me momentarily breathless. I pressed the call button frantically, my eyes never leaving the impossible figure outside. When the flight attendant arrived, I could barely contain the tremor in my voice. "There's someone on the wing," I whispered, my gaze fixed on the window. Her expression shifted from professional concern to confusion as she followed my gaze. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't see anything," she said after a moment, her tone attempting to reassure me, but I could see it, clear as day. The figure was moving, walking along the wing with an unnatural grace, as if the laws of physics that should have torn them away were of no consequence. I felt the blood drain from my face, my heart racing as I struggled to make sense of the vision before me. "Please, look again," I urged, desperation seeping into my voice. The flight attendant cast another glance outside, then back at me, her expression softening. "Sir, there's nothing there. Maybe the light and shadows are playing tricks on your eyes. We'll be landing soon. Try to relax." But relaxation was a state far beyond my reach. As she moved away, I continued to stare, transfixed, at the figure that now seemed to be staring back at me, a pale, featureless face pressed against the window, eyes that were dark voids in the dim light. I recoiled, my heart pounding against my ribcage, my breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. I blinked, and in that fraction of a second, the figure vanished, as if it had never been there. I was left staring at an empty wing, the normalcy of the sight doing nothing to ease the terror that gripped me. The remainder of the flight passed in a blur. I sat, rigid and alert, until the wheels touched down and the plane taxied to the gate. Even as I joined the stream of passengers disembarking, a part of me kept expecting to see the figure again, waiting among the crowds or following at a distance. I never did see it again, and no one else on that flight reported anything out of the ordinary. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself it was a product of stress, fatigue, or a trick of light and shadow. Yet the memory remains vivid, a chilling reminder of the flight and the last passenger, unseen by others but unforgettable to me.